Good morning. On behalf of the Federation of European Academies of Medicine Forum, the FEAM Forum, it's a great pleasure to welcome you at the International Transfer of Health Data Cross-sectoral Roundtable. This roundtable will take exactly 90 minutes. The different interventions will be filmed, so it's a recording that will be available afterwards. And it's my great pleasure to invite Professor George Griffin, the president of FEAM, to open this event.
Well, thank you, Stefan. Good morning, everyone. Just first of all to say the forum is a group of like-minded people from different elements of health. We have patient groups, we have industry, we have academe, and very importantly, we always have representation from the EU, so they know what we're talking about. So welcome to all of the speakers, welcome to all of the discussants. Now, at first sight, international transfer of health data appears a very esoteric subject to be looking at. But we've been having discussions over the past few months in this area, and it's opened my eyes to realize just how crucial it is to get this right. It's important for patients, their health, and particularly if they get ill and transfer is needed, important for research, it's important for security and ethical dimensions of information and storage and its dissemination. So this is an area which affects us all. It's an area which we mustn't neglect, and we must get this correct before it gets out of hand. And that's exactly the reason that the FEAM Forum thought this was a very important area to be discussing, from patients through to academics, through to clinicians. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing everyone today and listening to the discussion. So welcome, and back to Stefan.
Thank you, George. So now we are starting a series of interventions that will take each 10 minutes. And we will start with Professor Giske Ørsen, who is director of the Cancer Registry of Norway. Professor Ørsen has a background both in medicine and public health and epidemiology. She is a professor, and basically she also teaches not only in Europe at the University of Oslo, but also in the United States at the University of Southern California Keck School of Medicine. She has been trained in Bergen, but also at UCLA. So she's sort of putting together medicine, cancer, epidemiology, public health, and she's really an expert in cancer epidemiology, which is probably one of the most important fields that would benefit and would drive this exchange of data. And she has focused a lot on breast cancer, but of course she worked on many other cancers. So with that, I would like Professor Ørsen to start her presentation, and thank you for participating.
Thank you very much, Stefan. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the data sharing needs and challenges. So I'll outline the needs on two areas. So let's see. So first of all, for research, there is a strong need for international collaboration in order to get the advances that we now need in medicine and in public health. We need to share these data safely. We need to protect the privacy of the individuals whose data we share. So we need to share the pseudonymized data. And in order to get large enough numbers, we need to actually collaborate with researchers also outside of the European Economic Area. And this is so that we can replicate our findings. When we have a finding in a smaller population, you really want to make sure that this holds true also in other international populations. In addition, for some other diseases that we're now studying, we know that it's very complex. So for example, in cancer, we need to have adequate numbers to study rare subtypes of diseases. And for that, we need to collaborate with other investigators. And also we need to identify complex patterns in the data. And for that, we need studies of vast numbers of individuals. And for that, we need international collaborations. Now, the data that we want to share are very often data from large cohort studies and registries. And so these data are so detailed that they're not considered to be anonymous. Now, you may wonder, how big is this problem? Well, we don't have exact numbers, but this is one example that was presented at a seminar last year by Dr. Robert Ice from the National Institutes of Health in the US. Now, the NIH in the US stands for probably a little bit under 30% of the total biomedical research in the US. And as you see on this slide, there is a large number of ongoing projects, or was in 2019, between the National Institutes of Health and European institutions. So on this slide, you see that there are almost 5,000 ongoing collaborative projects. Now, we don't know how many of these projects involved data sharing, but probably a large number of them did. And these data were then shared before GDPR went into effect. I'll get back to the reason why later. Now, there is also a need to share data in public health. We need to share data with international organizations to summarize public health challenges worldwide. You know about COVID-19, but there are also a number of other diseases, such as cancer. In order to monitor cancer rates, we actually need to share the data with WHO. And also, there is a need to collaborate with international organizations to do research. Now, again, these data are also so detailed that they're not considered to be anonymous. And so within cancer, we would like to share data with International Agency for Research on Cancer. So what is the problem then? Well, now I, as a non-lawyer in this audience with many lawyers, I'm going to try and explain a little bit about the legal challenge. And the reason why I have to do this is because I need to show also those of you who are lawyers that we have done our homework. So please bear with me. This is a medical professional's simplification of the law, but just to give you an indication of what we have been working on with lawyers, of course. So we work very closely with Heidi Beate Benson from the University of Oslo. And this is a slide I borrowed from Heidi, and this essentially shows the layered approach within GDPR. So we know that there are some countries that actually are considered to have an adequate data protection. And these are indicated on this map. There are not that many, but there are some. But for most of the data transfers that we do, we need to consider the appropriate safeguards according to Article 46 in GDPR. And then there are some rare instances where the exceptions, the derogations outlined in Article 49 may apply. So for example, initial transfer of COVID-19 data. But for most of the time, it's really the appropriate safeguards that we have to consider. So what have we done? Well, here is Article 46 in GDPR, and many of the others in this webinar can talk much more in detail about these various points, but essentially there are a number of possible mechanisms here, and they may turn out to be wonderful mechanisms, but many of them we don't even have guidelines on yet. Many of them will take a long time to set up. There is at least one that has been used and is being used for a number of data transfers, and that is the Standard Data Protection Clauses, the SCCs. Now, we learned in December 2018 at the meeting with the National Cancer Institute that there was a challenge with this with US federal institutions such as the NIH. So what we then did, and this is a group in Oslo, including Heidi Benson, we worked with NIH lawyers. We got hold of the NIH senior lawyers, and we asked them to identify exactly what the problems were and exactly what in US federal law did it conflict with. And they pointed that out to us. We reported it to the Norwegian Data Inspectorate, which has reported it to the EDPB and the Commission. Now, next, this year, There were guidelines that were published by the EDPB in January on 2 other mechanisms. So we immediately started working on 3B on administrative arrangements. And again, we contacted the NIH lawyers. And again, they pointed out exactly what the problems were and that they conflict with the US federal law. And we reported this in the hearing round to the EDPB in May this year. So now what are we doing? Well, now we're working on mechanism 2A, these bespoke agreements. But the lawyer who's working on this right now, she's dragging her feet a little bit because she knows and we know that this is likely to also be a challenge with US federal law. And wild guess from my side is that it will have exactly the same challenges that we already have identified with administrative arrangement. So where does this leave us? We currently lack mechanisms for transferring data to researchers in the US who are at federal institutions such as the NIH, at public institutions, and this also applies to researchers at private institutions for some projects, for example, involving genetic data that are funded by the National Institutes of Health. We also lack mechanisms for transferring data to WHO. So we cannot now share data with International Agency for Research on Cancer. These challenges, they affect both direct transfer if you want to actually send data, but they also affect remote access. If we want to give researchers in the US access to data on a server in Europe, these challenges also apply. And they apply to research moving forward. So now it's stopping research. I talked to a senior NIH person last night, and there are at least 40 projects that are now being stopped. I think that's an underestimate because I know 2 projects at my own institution. But this also affects already transferred data. So of the ongoing collaborations, of those 5,000 collaborations that Dr. Ice talked about last year, what is the basis they have now in GDPR? This is a real concern. So what's being done? Well, there is some ongoing work. You heard about the working group between FEAM, ALEA, and ESAC. That will result in a report, and we hope that that report will be widely read and that it will be useful both for EDPB and for the Commission. There are several institutions working to develop agreements according to Article 46(2)(a), these bespoke clauses, but again, with federal institutions in the US, I don't think this is going to work. And then also, because I haven't said anything about it, yes, we are of course also working on additional measures with according to Schrems 2. I don't think that's going to be such a challenge. I think this transfer mechanism is the real problem. So we need a workable mechanism for transferring data. We think that perhaps a revision of the standard contractual clauses might be the best option. We would like to encourage the European Data Protection Board to provide guidelines on all transfer mechanisms, but we really need good examples of something that works, that solves the conflicts with other countries' national laws. So it's not enough with guidelines. We actually need to have workable examples that we can all copy in order to share data safely. Because finally, we know that if researchers do not have a safe transfer mechanism that protects the privacy of European citizens, researchers are creative. They will come up with creative solutions that offer less protection for European citizens. And this is what we need to avoid. So we really need a safe mechanism. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. You don't even know how important is what you just said for us. We are facing a major problem because we are part of the COVID human genetic effort. We were ready to transfer 80 sequencing files to Rockefeller in New York, and that has been blocked by our hospital. And we are desperately working to try to find a legal way to participate in this project. So it's really important to find a solution to this. But let's move on, and we'll keep it for the discussion. The next speaker is Alisa Weckerman, who is a policy officer, and she focuses on international data flows and protection at the European Commission. So we are delighted to have the European Commission's position and help on this huge problem. Alisa, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning to everyone, and thank you very much for the invitation. It has already been said, but of course I fully agree that international cooperation in this area and transfers of health data for research purposes, it's a very important topic. I think we all understand and recognize the value of such transfers. And yeah, in the last months, I think we've seen that the importance of this has, of course, again, been underlined very much in the context of the current pandemic. So I'm very happy to have this discussion with you today. There are a lot of speakers from the research community, which, as was already done, will speak more about the experience on the ground. So my idea was to focus more on the ongoing work at EU level in this area. Some of these initiatives were already briefly mentioned. Because I believe that there are different ongoing work streams within the European Data Protection Board, but also of the Commission, that are indeed very relevant for you and for the issue that we're discussing today. Maybe from the outset, and more generally, I would like to highlight that the Commission recognizes that and is aware that the application of the GDPR in the context of health research and scientific research more generally is an area where more guidance and more clarification is needed. It's also something that probably, as you know, we highlighted in our communication on 2 years of GDPR application, which was issued in June, July. And there we also highlighted that there is indeed a need for further guidance, and that what we hear from stakeholders is that there is also sometimes a lack of awareness and a lack of understanding, for example, among regulators that deal with these issues. So that is also why we are working very closely with the EDPB on its upcoming guidance. So for example, as you probably know, the EDPB is now working on guidance on the application of the GDPR in the context of scientific research and how to interpret these specific provisions in the GDPR that deal with scientific research and provide sometimes for certain exceptions. So one thing that we've done is we've prepared very detailed questions on the basis of input that we received from the scientific research community, based on questions explaining why certain information is needed, including very concrete examples. And we shared that with the EDPB also as a way to feed their work and to raise this awareness. I think this was also very important from our side to make sure that this guidance is really practical and useful for the scientific research community. And of course, that is more general guidance, but one of the questions that we shared with the EDPB was also relevant for international transfers. So that is also something that we hope will then be addressed in this guidance. And then beyond that, we are, of course, also working with the board on other guidance instruments. The main one, I would say, it was already mentioned by the previous speaker, was on the guidelines on transfers between public authorities. Because indeed, as you know, the GDPR refers specifically to international agreements and administrative arrangements, or non-binding instrument, memoranda of understanding, specifically for public authorities. Indeed, the EDPB issued a first draft of this guidance earlier this year, and that was open to public consultation. It was already mentioned in this public consultation, there was also feedback from the research community, including from organizations that are present today. And we're very much participating now in the ongoing work of the EDPB on this. So what is now happening is EDPB is going through all this feedback and preparing a final version of these guidelines. I think that these guidelines already demonstrated the flexibility in this area. For example, for certain safeguards like redress and oversight, which I think I assume are also the most relevant in the context that was already mentioned, for data transfers, for example, to the US or to international organizations. On those points, the guidelines does recognize that certain mechanisms might not work in all contexts, and it also indicates that alternative mechanisms can be developed. And we have read with a lot of interest all the feedback that was provided on this, especially from the research community. Of course, I cannot prejudge the final outcome of the discussions within the EDPB, but what I can definitely say is that these comments have definitely allowed to raise awareness in the EDPB on these issues, because you have to understand that data protection is a cross-cutting issue, and data protection experts, like some data protection authorities like us, we cannot be experts also in all fields. So not all data protection authorities necessarily have a lot of experience in working with the research sector, and not everyone is aware of the specificities of this sector. So the type of feedback that has been provided in this context, I have to say, which was very concrete and very, it pointed to specific parts of the guidelines and what would be useful in terms of guidance for the research community, and what would be specific. That has been extremely helpful. Other tools on which the EDPB is currently working, they have not been mentioned so far, but I think that in the future these are going to be very useful instruments for the scientific research community, are of course codes of conduct and certification as transfer mechanisms. This is also something that we stressed in our communication on 2 years of GDPR, because the EDPB is currently working on this guidance. And we hope that really this whole mechanism, especially for codes of conduct, will be in place as soon as possible, because I think that especially the codes of conduct can be a very useful tool for certain sectors, like the research sector, where you have certain specificities, where you have various parties that have to cooperate. It's not just, often not a bilateral relation. So these type of instruments, I think, will be very useful in the future. Of course, unlike the other tools, like, I don't know, standard contractual clauses, these are more bottom-up tools. It's something that has to be developed by the sector itself, and then it would go to a data protection authority and then to the Commission to give it general validity. But if there would be initiatives to develop these type of codes, we would be very interested to support, or to support in any way that we can, because we very much believe in the usefulness of these tools. A last thing I wanted to mention, because it was already raised, is our ongoing work of the Commission on, indeed, the modernization of the standard contractual clauses. So this is something that we have been working on for quite some time now, because, as you know, the existing SECs, they were adopted quite some time ago, 10 years or 20 years ago. And since then, a lot has changed. So there was definitely a need to update those clauses, to bring them in line with the GDPR, but also to modernize them and to make them more adapted to the current situation. And this whole process, this is something that we did and that we are doing in close consultation with stakeholders from, of course, the commercial sector, but also from the research sector, because we know that the SECs are also used in the context of research cooperation. So I don't want to go into too much details in my first introduction, but of course I can come back to the substance of the new SECs later on if there's an interest in that. But some of the things that we're working on is, and it's something that we heard a lot from stakeholders, is that there was a need to cover more scenarios, more transfer scenarios. At the moment, the existing SECs only cover controller-to-controller transfers or controller-to-processor transfers. And we are expanding the SECs, the new SECs, to also cover, for example, processor-to-processor transfers. Another novelty will be that we, instead of having the SECs as a contractual tool between two parties, we are designing them in such a way that multiple parties can accede to the SECs throughout the life cycle of the contract. And that is something that I think will also be very interesting for your community. Indeed, also the Schrems II judgment was already mentioned by the previous speaker. That is a last thing that we are doing now in our work on the SECs, because we're almost done with finalizing the SECs. We should be able to publish our draft in the coming weeks. But the reason that it's taking now a bit more time is that, of course, in the summer, there was a very important judgment of the Court of Justice on international transfers, where the court confirmed the validity of the SECs, but also further clarified the conditions under which they can be used. So what we're doing now is we're trying to incorporate certain elements of those clarifications provided by the court into the SECs, to provide entities that use the SECs with a certain toolbox, with a methodology on how to use them after the judgment. And we think that will be an important tool to assist entities with their compliance efforts under the GDPR. So as I said, we want to publish a draft of the new SECs in the coming weeks, and with that we will launch the adoption process. So the final adoption, of course, will still take some time. And once we publish a draft, we will also further consult stakeholders, and we definitely also want to consult then the research community on this. So yeah, that will be something for the coming weeks, or maybe for November. I think I will stop here. Maybe several questions or several interesting points were already raised by the previous speaker, but I will perhaps leave it for later. I understand that there might also be more specific questions. So I think I will stop here. Thank you very much.
We thank you very much. And we will have a very interesting discussion, of course. The next speaker is Laura Dreschler. She has a very interesting background. She got her law degree at the university in Vienna. So she did legal studies, and then she specialized at KU Leuven in European law, public international law, and human rights law. She has a master's of law in public international and European law from KU Leuven in 2015. Since 2017, she embarked into a PhD at the Free University of Brussels. And she is actually focusing on this very interesting problem of data transfer. And she focuses on exactly the role of data subject rights in the trans-border data transfers. So I'm delighted to welcome Laura to this webinar, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. And thank you for that kind introduction. Indeed, I'm a researcher at the VOB, and I'm looking into personal data transfers under GDPR, but also under other EU legal frameworks. So this was a very interesting topic for me to look a bit, how does this all work for health data? And in my 10 minutes, I wanna briefly point out 3 issues that I see from a data protection law perspective with maybe the current setup of the GDPR that would apply for health data transfers. The first thing I see, and it has already been mentioned, is that the transfer regime under the GDPR is quite complicated and is quite complex. I think the first problem we have here is that actually we don't have a legal definition of what a transfer is. We always talk about transfer, and this is a data transfer, and this is, but we don't actually know what is, because there is no definition in the GDPR itself. And we have no conclusive guidance yet on this from the EDPB or another authority. What can we consider a transfer? In practice, this means that the rules on transfers are maybe much wider applicable than we would think at first, because it has been mentioned by the first speaker, it's also applicable if someone gets access to data in the EU from outside of the EU. So this is like potentially very wide. It can concern, like, if you put data in a data repository on a website, or you put it in a cloud, this can all fall under transfer rules. So this is a very wide application of this. And as long as we don't have a definition of what a transfer is, we cannot exclude anything from that. So that, yeah, that makes the regime very widely applicable. And I see this at a first point of concern where we need clarification. The second thing is that the different transfer mechanisms that the GDPR offers, has also been said already, are quite complicated and quite intricate, and it's not a perfect match yet for health data. It has been said there are these 3 options. We have adequacy decisions, appropriate safeguards, or derogations. Since Schrems 2, we know that actually the standard of protection these mechanisms have to ensure is the same, at least for adequacy decisions and appropriate safeguards. What does this mean? We know that for adequacy decision, the European Commission has to see if another country or international organization has a level of protection that's essentially equivalent to that in the EU. So that's a very high standard of protection. And now we know that this is also the standard of protection that we have to go for if we're using appropriate safeguards. But under appropriate safeguards, this is the task of the person using them. So if you look at health data research, this would be the task of the hospital transferring the data, or whoever is the controller in the transfer. And we don't know yet how the controller can ensure such a high level of protection, especially if we consider that so far, whenever the Commission did it, there was a lot of concerns by the Court of Justice. We had Schrems 2, which invalidated Privacy Shield, but there was also Schrems 1, which did Safe Harbor. There was the opinion on the PNR agreement with Canada, which dealt with similar issues. So far, we don't really have a blueprint. How can we achieve this high level of protection? And I feel it makes it very hard for controllers to actually know what they have to do to get there. And now we also know that they might have to do additional things like suitable safeguards, and there's a lot of discussion in the legal community right now. What can those be? Can we work with encryption? Can we work with technical measures? But there's not much clarity yet what would really fulfill this high standard of protection. And then finally, derogations. I think there might be a better option than has previously been assumed. The court in its Schrems 2 judgment actually said that they don't think it's necessary to make the effects of the judgment only temporary, because derogations can be relied on in between. So I think this shows slowly that we're going into a direction where derogations are not seen anymore as these absolute exceptions, but maybe something that can be more widely used. Also, the European Data Protection Board, in their guidance on derogations, has said that indeed there's a recital that says some of them can only be used for non-regular transfers, but this is not for all of them. For example, the option to use consent as a derogation is available for also non-regular transfers. However, consent is hard to be used if it's a public institution doing the transfer. So here we have maybe more options than we think, but we still have to see how this works if it's a public institution relying on them. Then this was the first set of legal issues I see with health data transfers. The second one would be that health research under the GDPR itself is quite complex. The GDPR provides all these exceptions from its rules for scientific research, but a lot of them rely on national law to be implemented. So the legal framework in the EU itself is very complex. For example, health data under the GDPR is considered a special category of data. So that's a set of data that the GDPR considers especially in need of protection. And health data is one of them. And for health data, member states have the option to adopt their own rules, how they can be processed, under what conditions, and what are the safeguards. And national states are doing this. And some actually have done very different rules on it. We have, for example, Ireland and the UK, who I think require often consent for health data research, but in other countries, they leave all options for the legal basis for such processing. So there's already conflicts within the EU, which makes this a very complicated legal space to navigate. So you have then to imagine that in the EU for health data research, we have different level of law. We have the GDPR, we have national law that adopts these exceptions, and then sometimes member states, because they are federal states, even have regional laws that are applicable. And with this like landscape of regulation that's applicable, I think it's really hard to say how are the rules actually for intra-EU research projects, what has to apply there. I'm not sure we have a clear answer to that yet, and I think this also affects the transfers. This affects the transfers because for transfers, you always have to see, okay, does this other country come to something similar in terms of protection than the EU? But if you don't know what standard of protection the EU is having, this is a very difficult comparison to make for both the Commission, but also for member states. So I think then my final thing, if you look at health data research transfers in particular, I think we also have to consider the problem of consent. I said before, consent might be a derogation that's usable for the health data research field, maybe not by public institutions. But then we have the problem that this consent overlaps with consent for medical research, which is an ethical legal requirement for many research projects. And here we are not quite sure how these different consent work with each other. Can you ask once for both, or do we have to separate them? There was some guidance of the European Data Protection Supervisor, but this is also an area where we need a much more clarification. So I think I will stop here also, and I'm looking forward to questions, and it's a very interesting panel for me. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. We will have a lot of questions at the end. The next speaker is Brandon Barnes, who is Director of Data Protection and Intellectual Property at the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Industries and Associations, the FPIA. The FPIA is a member of our forum, and we worked together for a significant period of time in the past with FPIA. And FPIA represents really the pharmaceutical industry operating in Europe, with 33 national associations and 40 leading pharma companies. It's really representing almost 2,000 companies that perform research, developing and bringing new medicines to patients, and patients to new medicine. Brandon Barnes joined FPIA in 2002 with a project to align national laws in new member states after the enlargement of 2004, and obviously 2007 was the next enlargement. And then he has been involved in multilateral trade and intellectual property issues. And more recently, he's developing new business models in neglected areas of disease and infection, either because of low frequency or poverty or other issues. He has experience for 18 years in the pharmaceutical industry and really focusing on finance, strategic planning, and public affairs. He has degrees in psychology and business, and we look forward to his presentation. So Brandon, the floor is yours.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thanks for inviting us to join this timely and excellent panel. I have to say the same thing as the first speaker. I'm not a lawyer, so I sort of apologize in advance for the inaccuracies. But speaking on behalf of the research-based pharmaceutical industry in Europe, what I wanted to do was actually to focus a bit on the Schrems II decision, which I think a couple of other speakers have mentioned. And I mean, essentially, as I understand it, the decision said three things. It said you could not rely on the privacy shield as a basis for transfers to the US anymore. It said the SCCs, the standard contractual clauses, were still valid as a transfer mechanism, but you needed to be sure that they would provide an adequate level of protection for people in the destination country. And the third thing they said was that the member state supervisory authorities were required to suspend or prohibit transfer of data if they believed that those standards could not be met. So I think that, in very broad terms, is an outline of the decision. The thing that I always come back to try and remember is this is not about health data. This is about, depending on your view, something about the US tech sector, but also about mass surveillance. After the judgment, Max Schrems said, he said, "I'm very happy about the judgment. It seems the court has followed it in all respects. It is clear that the US will have to seriously change their surveillance laws if US companies want to continue to play a major role on the EU market." So it's not about health data. But unfortunately, health and research can be seriously affected. I mean, if we look at the flows that we're closest to, pharmacovigilance data, clinical trial data and regulatory submissions, data being shared in research collaborations, clinical research data, real-world data related to healthcare treatment outcomes and disease surveillance data. And it's not a complete list, but these are vital data flows. It makes to our understanding, no sense that these flows should be put in doubt. They play a vital role in the innovation process. They are vital for public health as well. In addition, many of them are subject to a lot of specific sectoral safeguards. I mean, most obviously things like the pseudonymization of the data, but also contractual conditions over their use and onward sharing, professional ethics, and international standards of good practice, such as good clinical practice. These are exceptionally highly regulated data flows. Final point under this sort of heading is that there's actually no evidence that these types of data are of interest to US intelligence. Of course, you can't say that would never ever be the case, but there's no evidence that that is the case. Despite that, I think, I mean, we're hearing from our members, and I think echoing the experience that the first speaker described, that we're now having people who are stewards of data saying, can I really sign documents to allow you to transfer data? Can I go ahead with this research collaboration? Can I approve this informed consent form for a clinical trial? You know, while it retains this language about international transfers of the data. And, you know, to be very clear, just to narrow down on the clinical trials piece, we must be able to share that data with regulatory agencies. They have to be able to interrogate that data if they want to. So what are we being asked to do as data exporters? We're being asked to verify prior to any transfer whether the importer is able to fully comply with the standard data protection clauses. And we have to carry out an assessment of the adequacy or the ability of those clauses to deliver an equivalent level of protection to that which is available in the EU. And I think, as one of the previous speakers hinted, I mean, essentially what we're being asked to do here is a bit like the job that the Commission do when they assess adequacy. So, you know, if a Commission adequacy assessment is trying to answer the question, does this country provide an equivalent level of protection, which the previous speaker said is certainly a very high standard. Now it is the individual company that's being asked to make that assessment when they decide whether they can make a transfer subject to the standard contractual clauses. So that's a pretty heavy obligation to place on people, and I can only imagine in the public sector it's probably even more difficult. So how has the private sector responded? I looked at what Business Europe had said, and they said the EU and US should sit down constructively and look for a solution, which is a good start. But they also said we need an intermediate solution. We need either a formal moratorium on non-application of penalties. Remember, the penalties under GDPR are very, very severe. We need a rapid solution to avoid a negative impact for the European economy at this very moment. And we hope that the responsible authorities will act pragmatically. So clearly, companies, I think, are going to look at their contracts, their encryption practices, their storage practices, ensure these are fit for purpose. But you know, the challenge is here that they're being able to asked to make quite a large, ambitious assessment of another country's legal system. And as I said before, this is a very heavy obligation. So how do we think the authorities should respond? A political solution would be, I think, very welcome, but I think is unlikely because of the US, not least because of the US political cycle. This probably isn't the administration that's most sympathetic to these sort of issues. And as well, going into an election, I would have thought it would be hard to get attention at this point. The new cross-sectoral privacy shield will very likely face legal challenges. One can hardly imagine that it won't. I think the DPAs need to address the internal divisions that were evident in their early public reactions, which went everywhere from very pragmatic responses that to statements that data transfers to the United States were now prohibited. The EDPP has confirmed it will issue guidance on the supplementary measures required by the judgment. I mean, I think this would be welcome, but they need to be clear and pragmatic and risk-based. I think we would particularly welcome it if the board was able to engage on looking at data sets that are unlikely to be the subject of surveillance measures. A moratorium on enforcement would provide relief, but DPAs have said there's no grace period. Everything changes from the date of the judgment. This is really tough. I mean, I think as the first speaker said, you know, redrafting your standard contractual clauses, your binding corporate rules is not easy. It takes a long time. So we can't do this quickly, and it would be good if a grace period should be offered at least until the EBP has provided this guidance. And I think there's a, you know, in some ways a bit of an equity argument here that we've been asked to do effectively adequacy assessments and to figure out what the appropriate safeguards are, and our regulators haven't yet given us any guidance on how we approach that problem. So you would think there is, you know, quite a reasonable case for pragmatism in this space. I think I would leave it there. I hope I haven't overrun too much.
Excellent, thank you so much. We are so precise in time, just 1 minute retard over the first part, so we are excellent. The next speaker is Carlos Luis Parra Calderon, who is actually a specialist and the coordinator of projects across European Union on health innovation and on medical informatics. He basically is a board member of the what we call EFMI, the European Federation for Medical Informatics Association. He represents Spain in this organization. He has a very important scientific activity. He's head of technological innovation at the Virgen del Rocio University Hospital and head of research and innovation group in biomedical informatics, engineering, and health economics at the Biomedicine Institute in Seville. So without further ado, I will just say that he has also collaborated with US specialists. So he can function on both Spain, Europe, and the United States fields. And with that, I will ask him to present his intervention, and the floor is yours. You need to unmute, so make sure that the microphone is
okay.
Good. Thank you.
Sorry. Good morning to everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to represent FEAM, European Federation for Medical Informatics, at this excellent roundtable. It's an honor to participate with all of you. In this roundtable, I represent the scientific community of biomedical informatics and medical informatics and health informatics. And my first reflection about the topic to discuss today is more and more in many projects I'm gaining experience as a lawyer and not as a biomedical informatician. And this should not be the case. I have a lot of problems, issues related to the how can take the authorization to get access, and if the not specifically I speak about international transfer, but when the project is related to the need to international transfer of health data, the issue is growing important extensions. My intervention will be about to share with all of you 3 different experiences. The first experience is to speak about one European project. I am the project coordinator of one big project currently in Europe, and the consortium coordinator is the name of the project is Fair for Health project. And FME is one partner of this project, but in this case I represent the Andalusian Health Service because this organization is the coordinator of the project. In this project, we work with data of electronic health record of different hospitals, and in this case, with one hospital of Geneva in Switzerland, and also work with not only with electronic health record, we work with a specific database for research in different countries in Europe and also in Serbia. In this project, we work with data of partners into the European Union, but also with two partners out of the European Union, in this case, Switzerland and Serbia. In this project, it's very curious. At the beginning, when we work in the proposal, and finally we wind the funding, one first limitation is the GDPR, the context, and the big limitation to share data between us, because the idea is to share data applying one important set of principles, very well known now in the way all the community, scientific community, working with data at international level. These principles are FAIR principles. The FAIR principles is about the four important need to share data. Is the data must be findable, accessible, interoperables, and reusables. This the FAIR principles today is the constitution of the around the world for all scientists try to work with data. Different important institutions at the European level, for example, develop important effort to implement the principle, FAIR principle. For example, FEAM, because I know important European project, IMI project like FAIR Plus and others to introduce the use of FAIR principle in the research in the international transfer of data. And also the European Open Science Cloud Initiative is other important European Union initiative to improve the capacity to share data at the European level. And for example, I need the strategy data science of NIH in US, and in this case today I work with in a initiative, and I will show some experience about this at the end of my presentation. About FAIR for Health project, the idea is apply FAIR principle, how can use the FAIR principle to share data around Europe and other countries, to analyze data, to improve the capacity to research in epidemiological studies about a chronic condition of multimorbidity patients. In this case, the FAIR, the big limitation of GDPR, we solve with technology. We research in technology, we research in methods of informatics, and we use one new concept, very common now, very cold topic for informatics, about federated data. We apply one specialization of this concept of federated data is about the concept about privacy preserving and distributed data mining. What mine this concept is the idea to share data to research with data, we don't need shared data. We have the legal context, we have the ethical context, and the idea is how can use all data in different sites to research and to share the capacity to research, and using algorithms to, in this case, the concept is the algorithms go to the data and the data don't go to the algorithms. And we use this kind of technology, we research in this kind of technology for the final objective to try to implement some algorithms to advance in new knowledge about pattern between the different variables in different databases around Europe, and in this case also with other databases in Switzerland and Serbia. But one conclusion about this project, the limitations of GDPR can be one opportunity to research in new methods and tools of health informatics to solve the problem, to share data, to advance in research. But in any case, it has cost of opportunity, because today, for example, the capacity to analyze data with federated data is very low and related to the capacity to share data in a big database. When we have the opportunity to share data in only one database, the capacity to analyze data is very bigger than when we need implement a lot of new complex technology with agents, etc., to solve the idea to a real transfer of data between different database, between different partners to research. This is an important conclusion. In any case, for us, it's an opportunity. No? Okay, this is one experience. Other is about one very short, fast experience, personally with MIT in Boston, in US, about share directly transfer data about COVID-19, because we collaborate with one research group of MIT Operational Research Center in Boston. And the idea, in 2 weeks, we send data about COVID-19 patients directly to the MIT to implement a machine learning algorithms to achieve one mortality score in hospitals for this application. We share data with hospital of Italy, Grecia, and US. And the experience, but in this case, we have two good situations. The first is about the very limited data, a very simple anonymization process, because it is a set of data related to clinical laboratory tests and so on, diagnostics code, etc. And other important element for the success of this sharing process is the situation about COVID-19 in April in my country, in my hospital, and in the rest of the world, but also in Spain, we have a lot of difficulties. Or data protection officer or security informatics team in Andalusian Health Service have a very good support to how can solve all the limitations of GDPR and Spanish law about data protection.
Sorry to interrupt. We are a little bit out of time, so okay. You can conclude.
Okay, sorry. And also only have tried to I think I have the opinion that this currently for the protectionist framework slow down research and innovation in Europe, I'm sure. But in any case, we have the opportunity for biomedical informatics to develop research and method to overcome legal limits like this kind of technology I short explanation today. Thank you for the opportunity, and we can discuss at the end of the.
Thank you very much. And I think the point you're making is very good. We have a new challenge, and that can be a source of progress if we solve the problem. With that, I will pass to the next speaker, who is the last intervention. It's Gözde Susuzlu-Briggs, who works as a project coordinator at the European Patients Forum. She focuses on digital health projects and the initiative Data Save Lives. Prior to that, she was involved in web and online service managing for international organizations. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Stefan. I can see the time limitation, so I will not make it very long because I think it was very clear with the discussions so far. We are all aware of the importance, and patients have the same view. So basically 92% of patients and patient organizations we work with are willing to play an active role managing their own conditions to share the health data. And 60% of the patients would be willing to actually participate in helping cross-border sharing health data. Because they are generally comfortable and willing to share their data, and especially they know if it is a vital importance to advance health research, because they are the one in the center of all the reality of the situation. And so they would like to have the ultimate benefit for the society living with chronic conditions, and now we are more extending to also cancer patients. It's a global need, and patients are very much aware of the situation. But in terms of the health data sharing, we know, of course, that the security has always been the center, and for patients and for us, it's been also one of our center of attention. So we would be saying patients and patient organizations are willing to be in the center from the beginning to help and co-create this trust environment, also why the secure guards, because we know that legislations and policies move slower, but we know innovative technologies help a lot to actually improve the safeguards so that actually they can also facilitate the policies and GDPR correspondence between EU countries and outside the EU countries easier by building a shield of a high technology around health data sharing. In that sense, we are already part as EPF many EU projects and IMI projects, and we're trying to bring the patient's voice already forward, including an initiative. Actually, EPF is a secretariat of a multi-stakeholder initiative. We're trying to increase the awareness of importance of health data sharing globally and mainly in the EU level right now. And we already see the discrepancies and the gaps within the EU. So we would be advancing all together, I think, very much so, not in little clusters, but all together. We think that the advancement will be easier. So Data Saves Lives is actually trying to bring, at least on the EU level, the conscience and awareness, not only patients, but on the whole ecosystem around the patients and the health data. So I will not make it any longer because I know we have the time. I would be happy to answer any questions and within the discussions, move forward with more subjects to discuss.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Wonderful.
you, Stefan.
Thank you. We're really grateful and looking forward to your answers to the further questions. So now we are opening probably the most active and dynamic part of this meeting, which is the question session. Now we have a number of questions from the FEAM ISAC ALEA group, and I will start with one of them. And basically, previous FEAM work has identified benefits for patients and public health from sharing personal health data for public sector research across the EU. But the question is, do you agree that there is potential value in sharing personal data for health research between the EU EEA countries, which are the European Economic Area, for those that don't know, like me a while ago, and other countries? And do you have examples and about such exchanges? So between EU, EEA, and other countries, and do you have any concerns about that? So maybe I will think about who would be the best. Maybe Alisa, what do you think about that question? I mean, it doesn't need to be that long, the answer, but what's your feeling?
Well, I think, okay, I think it's clear that there is a value in sharing this information. I think this has been highlighted several times by various speakers here today, so that I think I agree. I think when it comes to examples, then I guess there are other speakers who are more in a better position to talk about that. All I can say is that, yes, I agree that there is an important value of that, but of course, at the same time, the focus of our discussion today is the rules on international transfers under the GDPR, and these rules are there. They apply across the board. They apply also in this context, and the importance of ensuring sufficient protections in an international context has also again been underlined by our court in the case that was mentioned already several times in the Schrems 2 case. So I think indeed it's a matter of finding this balance between allowing and facilitating transfers of personal data, which, by the way, is also one of the things that it's one of the objectives of the GDPR, to facilitate international data transfers, but while, of course, ensuring this sufficiently high level of protection.
Okay, so one question that I like from this working group was, what works well because of GDPR? Can anybody give an example of what works now better because of GDPR in this area? I mean, can we find an example where GDPR actually helped?
I think, I mean, I think Laura Dreschler sort of distinguished the sort of internal intra-EU environment and the international transfers environment. I think we're in a very difficult space on the internal side. I mean, the implementation of GDPR has been immensely complex and remains to be, and some of the causes of that complexity are actually quite difficult to resolve. It's not as if you can just say the Commission can wave a magic wand and fix them. Probably can't. I think we felt as an industry that the framework that GDPR created for research, and particularly for the secondary use of data, was potentially very, very useful and, you know, helpful in terms of where we're going in terms of, you know, the use of very high volumes of data. The problem is that so much was left to the implementation, and we're in, you know, a very difficult space at the moment as a result of that. On the international side, I think it's quite difficult to see the positives at this point. I mean, you know, the sort of flows I was describing, I mean, to us, it's absolutely extraordinary that those flows are being put into question. They have such clear benefits for innovation and public health that quite troubling.
Okay.
Could I also briefly react to this?
Yes.
Thank you. Because you asked, you know, has there been anything positive about the GDPR, which I find it's quite a tough question. I mean, not tough, but quite, I don't know, the way it's posed already sends a certain signal. What I want to highlight, of course, is that these rules are not new. They didn't come out of nowhere. The GDPR has replaced or reformed the rules that were in place for more than 20 years. And especially in the area of international transfers, there have been no substantial changes. The rules have been the same. The mechanisms that existed under the previous rules are still there. What the GDPR has done, it has added more tools and provided further clarifications on how they can be used. So I want to get that straight first. Of course, what is true is that there is a lot more attention to these things now. And I think that is maybe also a difference within the research sector compared to, for example, the commercial sector, the tech industry, where data protection and privacy has been sort of part of the business model for quite some time, and several tools have already been developed and are very widely used. Maybe this is something that is happening now within the research community. So I understand there's a lot of there's more attention to this. What we hear from stakeholders, this is also something that was part of our work on the 2 years evaluation of the GDPR. What we hear is that first, of course, for individuals, a lot more individuals are aware of their rights, a lot more individuals are using their rights. So I think that is definitely a positive effect of the GDPR. What we hear from other stakeholders, from those that are actually handling data, is that one thing that the GDPR was very useful for, because it focuses so much, for example, on the principle of accountability, is that it has allowed controllers and processors to get their data house in order, so to say. It allowed them to have a closer look at what data are they actually processing, for which purposes. Do they actually need all this data? Do they have to rethink a bit how they structure all of this? So that is one of the things that we heard a lot. And of course, I think data protection, that's true for the commercial sector, but I think it's very much the same in an area like health research, where you're dealing with a lot of sensitive data, is that strong privacy rules are an essential element to obtain trust. Patients were already mentioned here, and I think trust is a key element of international transfer, international cooperation, and also in this area of scientific research. And I think data protection and strong privacy protections play a key role there.
Okay, so
can I add something, please,
Sure.
Stefan?
Sure.
Okay, thank you. I agree with the last thing that Elisa said in terms of data protection, and the trust is very important. But in terms of international data transfers, I think that where it has worked is when the SCCs work, it's very nice that there's one common mechanism that works. So for private institutions, such as I assume the MIT is using the SCCs, that was very nice. But as of business before GDPR, it's very different. We actually had something in our health research law that allowed us to share de-identified data, and that was removed when GDPR went into effect. So I think that, and I don't know about other countries, but things have really changed, and that's the new part, that we cannot actually transfer. We don't have a legal mechanism that can be used.
And that's intertwined with the next question, which is for the DG Justice, right? Again, what is the Commission doing to respond to these research concerns, and on which timetable? So let's say that there are some positives for the GDPR. First of all, the practice is more rigorous. Today, the research sector applies rules that were a long time well applied in the private and commercial. We understand that point. But when there are some things that have to be fixed, what is the timetable that the Commission thinks could really apply to fix those things and really communicate with countries to come up with a good solution?
Well, I don't know if I can reply in a general way to this. As I said, I think I've tried to make clear that we are taking this seriously. You know, we are hearing the issues that you're raising, that your community is raising. That's also, for example, the work that I mentioned, that is also why we prepare these questions, for example, for the EDPB on scientific research. We're engaging with the EDPB also on these issues, as I mentioned, also in the question of transfers between public authorities. Very concretely, in terms of timeline, as I said, on the SCCs, the new draft, which I think will be relevant in many cases for you as well, for those that rely currently on the SCCs, will come out in the coming weeks. One thing I do want to mention that, you know, I think I fully understand some of the issues that have been raised today, and I want to say that I very much agree with what Giske from the Norwegian Cancer Registry said on the need for good examples, because I think what was said today, I think it's clear that the GDPR does provide for tools, but in practice they have not been developed or not widely used in this specific context. So, and I see that, especially from today, I see that a lot of interesting work has actually already been done or is being done in, for example, in identifying what does not work in certain contexts. And I think that work can also very usefully feed in developing certain tools concretely now. And I also have been informed from my contacts with other stakeholders in this area that there are also research projects that have managed to develop comprehensive contractual tools for international research cooperation. So what, in my view, would be very interesting also for us at the Commission and for the data protection authorities would, for example, be if the research sector, and we can of course assist in that, will be able to look for existing best practices, which I'm sure do exist, and start thinking concretely about solutions. For example, if there are certain issues in terms of oversight and redress, which I assume is something that can be the case for data sharing between public authorities, think against the guidelines of the EDPB, what type of mechanisms could provide for solutions. And I think that would also allow all of us to enter in a more productive discussion where we really focus on what is specific for this context. Because as the Commission, of course, what we can do, we're not the enforcers of the GDPR, but what we can do is challenge this with the EDPB, like we are doing, for example, with the questions on scientific research more generally. So we can bring this to the table within the EDPB. That's also a bit our role sometimes there, to bring the general public interest into these discussions. And then at the same time, we're also always available to engage with specific stakeholders in fora like this, but also bilaterally. And sometimes the most useful thing that we can do is very concretely in a specific case, help with facilitating a dialogue, for example, by bringing all relevant actors, including, for example, data protection authorities around the table. So that to say what we are doing, what we can do, but I think there's also an important role for your community to provide us with that information and also to engage on finding solutions. And we are very happy to assist in that and to support that in any way that we can, of course, to the extent it falls within our competence as the Commission.
Great. I think that the standard contractual clauses have been mentioned, the SCCs. What I think would help a lot if, for example, you would have hospitals or big universities that need to transfer data to very good institutions in the United States and Canada and Japan for the good of everyone. Do you think that those could come to you, to the Commission, to some body of the Commission and say, look, we have this concrete problem. What do we do? Do we build an SCC? How do you, because, people want to learn, but they also want to advance their project. You have that when you, let's say, buy equipment, you call the manufacturer and they help you with the technical service. Now, do you guys at the Commission have some kind of interaction platform that people can quickly learn and, get input?
Well, no, we don't have a platform like that because, as I said, we are not the enforcers of the GDPR. Those are the national data protection authorities. They are best placed also to provide guidance in specific cases. But as I said, we are always ready to engage. We're always ready to receive feedback, to receive input, and happy to support. One thing that I mentioned, of course, right now, of course, this whole system has not been fully set up yet. This is something that the EDPB is currently working on, but I mentioned codes of conduct, which I think would be a very interesting tool for this sector. And it is a bottom-up tool. It's something that has to come from the specific sector, but the Commission, of course, we are ready to work on that with you. We will be ready to support that in any way that we can. One thing I would like to say about the SCCs, because I understand, of course, they're the most widely used tool because they are a ready-made tool. They're easy to implement. But because of that, of course, they're a standardized tool. They're not specific to certain types of transfers, certain types of cooperation, or certain destinations. And, certain key aspects that allow for that standardization at the moment are elements that work best in a commercial context. Things like third-party beneficiary rights that individuals can invoke, that oversight is carried out by EU data protection authority, that the EU courts remain competent. And I understand that those elements, not always work or might not work where the data importer is a public authority, but it's also, you have to understand that these are key elements that allow for this standardization, which works in a commercial context or in certain contexts. With public authorities, it's much more difficult to have a one-size-fits-all approach. And I think that's also very clearly reflected in the guidance from the EDPB. Of course, doesn't mean that other instruments cannot be used. SECs are not the only tool. And I think if there's certain elements of the SECs that currently do not work for certain public authorities, one useful work that could be done is, of course, take the SECs as a starting point, take whatever does work, and try to adapt those aspects that don't work. And for example, that could allow to develop an ad hoc, tailor-made contractual tool. So I think there are ways. I'm not saying it's always easy, but
okay.
I think that there can be ways of finding solutions. Thank you.
So
Sorry, I didn't want to.
Thank you. Giske Ersin has an interesting question on derogations.
So thank you. So Laura, you talked about the derogations and you mentioned consent. And the challenge that we have in epidemiology for consent is that these data were collected, maybe 20, 30 years ago. And so then that's very difficult. But when you raised it, I started thinking, well, what about other parts of Article 49? What about the public interest? Because there's been some pressure to say that, well, maybe medical research really falls under public interest. And we know that at least one data inspectorate in Denmark has a very, very strict definition of when you can use this. So I would like to hear what your thoughts are, and perhaps Elisa afterwards, on can we sort of expand our interpretation of the public interest derogation?
Yes, thank you. Indeed, I think that public interest as a derogation would offer a huge opportunity. And I've also heard that this is an area where national law sometimes defines public interest in a way that's restricting. And I think we will have to see if that's in line with the derogation, because the derogation is, of course, not an area where actually member states have room to specify. So it's a EU definition, it's an EU concept. And I think as long as it's, I think the thinking now is if it's a recognized public interest in national or EU law, it's accepted, and the EU treaty does have an interest in health research and fighting epidemics and such on. And actually, if you look at the GDPR, they mention contact tracing and epidemics in the recitals. So it has openings for saying that this is in the public interest to transfer data. And I think this would be a good path also, because then you can see what is actually on my legal basis for processing data on a national level, because then you could also go for public interest. Because yeah, if you think about the GDPR, you always need a legal basis to process the data, and then you need an additional one to transfer the data. So if you use for processing the data also public interest, then you have a nice alignment there, which might work nicely. And for public interest, the recitals of the GDPR make clear it's not just for non-regular transfer. So public interest is actually a derogation you could use maybe in a more regular context if you follow the latest findings of the court. The derogations are not as restricted as we always thought they're meant to be.
Thank you very much. This is very, very interesting. We are approaching the end. I have a very quick question, very short answer, please. Medical informatics. So the new challenges, for me, one of the messages I take home from this is that there is huge opportunity for business in medical informatics consultancy. If you create a good company that can solve these issues, put all the actors together, that could make a huge progress. So from the medical informatics point of view, have we seen novel tools that emerge to help the new challenges revealed by the proper use of the GDPR and the rules that even existed before, but were not that much respected? So I'm talking about the medical informatics people, and I was thinking about you, Carlos.
That's for me the question. Yes, in my introduction, I explained some details for different concepts and new methods. All the need for reduce the whole, if we need transfer data but we can solve this limitation is possible today, but in any case, need more time to research and to improve this kind of technologies. For example, I can explain more details about the capacity to federate data. Maybe we need transfer data to research. We need make questions, research questions about some, for example, about COVID-19. And the first need is we need share data to make the question for between different databases into countries in Europe, different countries in Europe and outside. And this kind of technology can offer the possibility to respond this question, and with in any case you don't need access directly to the data. How work this kind of technology? The idea is that some informatics agent travel to your database and learning and go out and go to the other database. Today we can know some experience how can work this kind of technology, and it's a very clear concept to solve one important limitation of the need to transfer health data. I don't know if it's
Thank you very much. So we are work in progress. I have seen that already Geeske Ursen's question was responded by Alisa, and you all can see the answer with what she agrees and disagrees at the end with certain aspects. So we are reaching now the end where I'm supposed to conclude. But before that, I want to ask George if he has any point that comes as very salient before I conclude.
Well, thank you, Stefan. I have to say that I'm a practicing physician in a London teaching hospital. I'm a clinical researcher, a biomedical researcher. So I've really enjoyed this discussion. Two things stick out to me. One is from Elisa, that essentially one size doesn't fit all. So, for example, data protection for engineering could be completely and is completely different from data protection in health. And so Elisa's idea of having examples on health, I think, is a very important one. And I'm sure we could help on that. The second thing is the area of consent, which has been mentioned. And we've heard Gudzi tell us that most patients would like their data to be used for the benefit of mankind. Now, if they were here today listening and they had consented for their data to be used and heard the obstacles that are in the way, I think they'd be very disappointed, really disappointed. Now, so if there is consent, and that's a whole topic of its own, of course, how valid is consent in the way it's usually obtained. But if there is consent and there is true data protection in terms of the informatics and the how data is saved on computers, surely we can break down the obstacles that we're seeing. And but I'm pleased that all of these things are really coming out into the open. And I'll finish there. And Stefan, thank you very much for being such an excellent moderator.
Thank you, George, for this very interesting points. So rather than summarizing everything that was said, which I think we all understood and appreciated, I would like to say that for me, I'm learning every day, and I'm moving from a position of rejection of all these things to a position that I have to learn them and respect them. because there is a positive, which is that I see more and more in the clinics that the patients themselves go on the internet and read about the diseases, read about the treatments, read about the research. And so we are now talking to the patients more than we were talking to other specialists 10, 15 years ago. So yes, we are a bit slowed down by these regulations, but also this big data and digital era help the patients become more aware. So I think we have to all start to work together and not antagonistically. I mean, it's not that the research community has to fight the commission or the bodies that have to protect the private data, but we have to all work together. And I think that in the end, there will be for the benefit of all. So with that, at 11:30 and a few seconds, I'd like to thank you all for participating in this wonderful event. And I'm sure Elisa will make a summary and will distribute this to all the participants. This is a recorded session. And with that, again, thank you and have a very good day in today. Bye. Bye.
Bye, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.